So we come to the end of this remarkable collection of essays, which really constitutes a whole book on a certain subject. Right? What that subject is continually um, in question. The subject is women in fiction, but that's just the subject that Woolf was tasked with speaking about. She's giving these lectures at, I believe, Girton College or Newnham College, one of the women's colleges at Cambridge University. And part of the book is her continual searching for the theme. And the nominal theme, again, is women in fiction, which is, to some degree followed. But it goes much deeper than that. Her continual questioning of what she's actually writing about is part of the depth of the book, I think. Because she's struggling with something pretty deep, I think. And that is questions about gender and questions about literature and questions about the relation between gender and literature, and especially, of course, the female gender and what that means for a woman writer. A remarkable beginning here in chapter 6, where she is at home. She's in her London home and she's looking out the window, and it strikes her that the kind of thing she's been writing about so far has really been about the very different ways that women and men think, the very different ways in which women and men write, and the very different ways, fundamentally, in which women and men experience reality. And then she has a moment where she's looking out the window and she sees a woman and a man walking down the street and coming together and getting into a taxi cab. And that sparks a thought. And that thought is that, if I can find it, that let's say right here. For certainly when I saw the couple get into the taxi cab, the mind felt as if, after being divided, it had come together again in a natural fusion. So much of what she's written so far has been very polarizing between men and women. But then there's this moment where this just sort of mundane occurrence of a man and a woman getting into a taxi together sparks the idea that the female and the male are meant to cooperate. She says the obvious reason would be that it is natural for the sexes to cooperate. But what does that come to in her thought? I think that culminates in the idea of the androgynous mind, which is something she takes from the great poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The androgynous, the mind needs to be androgynous. He says Coleridge certainly did not mean, when he said that a great mind is androgynous, that it is a mind that's in special sympathy with women, a mind that takes up their cause or devotes itself to their interpretation. Perhaps the androgynous mind. And androgynous is a made up Greek word or made up word in English from the words for man and woman. Andros and Vune are the two, it's just man woman. So androgynous means a melding or a combination of the male and the female. Perhaps the androgynous mind is less apt to make these distinctions than the single sexed mind. He meant perhaps that the androgynous mind is resonant and porous, that it transmits emotion without impediment, that it is naturally creative, incandescent. And that's a word she comes back to again and again, and especially in reference to Shakespeare. The incandescent mind, the luminous mind, the mind that is bright and throws light upon the world, like Shakespeare did, incandescent and undivided. In fact, one goes back to Shakespeare's mind as the type of the androgynous, of the man womanly mind. So I think, in a certain way, that's the culminating idea of this book, is the idea that ideally, for literary genius, a mind should not be female or male, but both. and that the best writers are the ones who are able to access both their female side and their male side. She gives a couple of examples, Mr. A uh, and somebody else's book. Mr. A, I'm guessing it's Aldous Huxley, but I don't know. She's reading his book and it's pretty good. She's like, "Oh, this is real men's writing," and she gives characteristics. But then she says she gets bored by it because it's too masculine. That is, it's too partial. And then she gives examples, a really interesting example of Rudyard Kipling, Mr. Kipling. That's a writer that I know, and her criticism of him, and I think she's right, is that he's too manly. There's nothing of the feminine in his writing, and that in itself is not bad. It's not like politically you have to be both men and male and female in your writing. It's just that it hurts his writing that he can't access that natural part of his mind, which is feminine, and that this is actually really interesting social criticism, because what she said basically is that because of the, let's say, burgeoning of women's rights movements in the 19th century, and she's writing this in 1928, that people are thinking more about sex and gender, and that's not such a good thing, because she sees somebody like Kipling, and then politically, fascism in Italy, she mentions Mussolini, as a male reaction, a defensive male reaction to the women's movement, women demanding their economic and political social rights, so that men become more masculine, and that this is bad, not in itself, but because to really like be a great writer, you need to have a mind more like Shakespeare. Shakespeare never thought about gender, and so in that sense, he was free to be womanly, right? Because the categories hadn't hardened. So it's actually quite, it goes beyond literary criticism. I think it's a general historical or social criticism that in her time, and we may compare it to ours, we're always having gender differences put into our faces. So we're hung up on them in a way that the great poets weren't, because they could just access their minds and they didn't worry about being masculine or feminine. They were just themselves. And so, just being naturally themselves, they were both masculine and feminine. It's really quite a thesis. Then she ties things up at the end with the break here. Here, then Mary Beaton ceases to speak, where she's adopted this persona of Mary Beaton. And she goes back to the theme, the distinct theme of the material conditions of being a writer and the need for economic security and to be free enough to spend the time necessary to be a great writer. And it's pretty amazing, too. She quotes Arthur Quiller Couch, who was a literary historian, I guess, of the time, who basically says, think of all the great writers of the 19th century. They all had money, except for Keats, poor Keats. Most of them had money and education. That is, he was saying, it's not a good thing about our world, but it seems to be a world where if you want to produce something really great in literature, it sure helps to be upper class. So really quite, I mean, I think this book is one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read. I have come back to it continually over the years. It's like the third or fourth time I've read it, and every time I read it, I get more out of it, and I'm so impressed by the challenge of Woolf's idea. It's just an amazing book.